Hello and welcome. My name is Paul Amos, and I'm founder of The Redeemed. The Redeemed is an organization that's meant for a judgment-free zone for men of all backgrounds to come together to be able to discuss both life's difficulties as well as life's triumphs. Today, we're on a webinar called Pursuing Restoration, and we have a very special guest. Please let me welcome you to Michael Cusick, a reverend, professor, acclaimed writer, and a personal friend. I think we've known each other for a little more than a year now, and I'm very thankful that Michael has had the opportunity to come on and join us today. And we're going to ask him to make some remarks, and then we're going to ask the audience if they have questions or questions that they'd like to ask of Michael, as well as I'm going to ask some questions myself. So we'll open it up. Once Michael's done with his talk, he'll pass it back over and say something to the effect of, let's open it up for Q&A, and then we'll answer your questions, and we'll hopefully do all this in about 45 minutes. So thank you all for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Paul. It's really an honor to be here and to share my story and the things that I've gleaned as I've been on a really messy journey. I've been a believer for almost 40 years in Jesus. And the first half of that road was a life where I lived externally as a guy that seemed to have it all together. And as you know, who had a lot of hiddenness and addiction and shame and brokenness in my life. So we're going to start with a story where I was 16 years old. And that would have been roughly 1980 for those of you that are doing the math. I had just become a Christian through the ministry of Young Life. And for a number of years, I claimed, that God didn't exist, or if he did, I didn't want anything to do with him. I was an angry teenager. And I went to Young Life, and I heard this idea of the good news that God loved me. It was the first time I had actually heard that in my life, and that the idea of God wasn't just a judge who wanted me to, avoid sin. And shortly after that time, I became convicted that the accumulation of porn magazines that were under my mattress and hidden, and that the behaviors that I was doing was trying to have sex with as many girls as possible or to be sexual with them, and compulsive, habitual, addictive masturbation. All of that was part of my life. And after I became a Christian, one day when Noah was home, I grew up in Northeast Ohio, kind of this blue collar factory community. And when no one was home, I took all of those porn magazines and I went down to the basement, and we had an incinerator in our house. And back then you would burn garbage in this big incinerator. And I threw the magazines in, and I lit a match, and I watched them turn to flames. I closed the lid and I walked away, and I came back, in about an hour, and there was a pile of ash. And I thought to myself, sincerely, God, I want this out of my life. It's not consistent with who I want to be, and I feel tremendous shame over it. And I said, God, thank you that this is gone and out of my life. And I sincerely meant that. And it wasn't more than 2 weeks later where I found myself again, just absolutely preoccupied with lust, caught up in compulsive, multiple times a day masturbation, seeking to be sexual with girls. And that problem went on and on and on. But the problem that was greater than my problem was I lived in isolation, and I lived in hiddenness, and nobody knew me. And I developed this double life. And occasionally I would go to my youth minister or the man that was discipling me, and I'd say, I'm kind of, sort of struggling with lust a little bit. And I wouldn't go into details, and I wouldn't talk about behaviors, but I would kind of hint at it. And what I would hear is, well, you need to memorize scripture. In Psalm 119, for example, it says, David says, how can a man keep his way pure? Oh, I've hidden your word in my heart. So I would hide God's word in my heart and memorize scripture. And I would pray harder, and I would study my Bible more. And the problem only got worse. Well, I went all through high school, and I had this hidden life. Got into college, and the problem became worse, and it escalated. And I started going to strip clubs. And eventually, as a single man, I crossed a line, and I started to pay for sex, and I started to hire high-end escorts. And of course, as a person might imagine, pursuing all of this compulsive pseudo sexual behavior I wasn't concerned with, and I wasn't able to have any kind of a healthy relationship because there was such deep shame inside of me. Continued to escalate until after college, when I began to work in my chosen profession. And one day I opened up the morning newspaper and it said, FBI raids escort service. My heart started to race and my face flushed, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is it. This is the end. The FBI had raided this escort service, this prostitution ring. There was a local celebrity and a quarterback from the football team where I grew up, the professional team. So it became this big deal, and I had been paying money to that escort service. And so I was convinced that it would become public, that this would come out, that my family would disown me, that God would finally just say, I'm done with you. Within 24 hours, I was in the office of a Christian counselor, and I shared my story for the very first time with any human being. I shared everything. And I shared not only about these sexual struggles in my behavior, but I said, I've never told anybody this, but I was sexually abused around starting at the age of 4. And that continued with an uncle, and then with a sibling, and then with a physician when I was 16 years old. I was one of these people that a caregiver, a physician, crossed boundaries with me and sexually abused me because I didn't know what was good and what was bad and what was healthy and unhealthy, and everything felt sexual. I tell the therapist this. I talk for 50 minutes nonstop because I have the gift of gab. And the therapist looked at me, he very conspicuous, just watched and said, we're almost out of time. I have a question and a comment, and I want to start with the comment. And he said, my comment is, Michael, you strike me as a very lonely man. And I felt like he had punched me in the gut because, see, I was a youth minister by then, and I was really extroverted, and I was really good at engaging with people. You know, I was the guy who could win friends and influence people, but deep inside I was lonely. Nobody knew me. And so here's this counselor where I present all this information, and he could have said 1,000 things like, you're a sex addict, which was true. Go read this book, which would have been helpful. But he said, you strike me as a very lonely man. And it knocked the wind out of me because it was as if he took a highlighter and just drew attention to the fact that with all of this relational, extroverted sense of self, could kind of win people. And even underneath my sexual behavior, that I was still lonely, And then he said, now question, are you ever at a loss for words? I still laugh when I think about that, because what he brilliantly did, instead of talking about my abuse or about my sex addiction, he put words to this deep longing inside of me for connection, to be connected to others, to be known, to live, if you will, as Genesis chapter 2, verse 27 tells us, to be naked and unashamed, which is about way more than just clothes or not. He put words to that longing that there's nowhere in your life where you can be naked and unashamed. You're just a poser. You're just a hider. And then, are you ever at a loss for words, which of course is very socially inappropriate. If you're at a Bible study or a potluck or something like that, and somebody comes up to you and says, are you ever at a loss for words? That's kind of offensive. But he said it to me, and it knocked the wind out of me, but I felt really loved. I felt like, on the one hand, here's these deep desires for connection, and you're still lonely. And here's this part of you that's kind of a schemer. In Ecclesiastes chapter 9, right in the middle of that book, the writer of Ecclesiastes says that God made man upright, but man has gone in search of many schemes. He was putting words on that side of, are you ever at a loss for words, to the schemes, to the strategies, to the coping strategies to cope with that pain inside. And what he was saying was, Michael, you have the gift of gab, you're charming, you're extroverted. And what we began to unpack for weeks after that is, Michael, you use words to keep people at a distance and to control. You strike me as a lonely man, and are you ever at a loss for words? My story went on into my marriage. We're 3 years into my marriage. In 1994, I came home from work one day and got caught in a lie, which unraveled a whole bunch of lies. And my wife, as a married man had to hear me say that I had committed adultery, that I had entered back into my addictive life with prostitutes, strip clubs, trying to pick up women. I had to share over that next couple of days that I was habitually and compulsively drinking to numb the shame. I was a Christian counselor full-time, and part-time I had another ministry, and I was working at a Christian university, and I literally had to drink on my lunch hour and whenever I was apart from my wife in order to numb that shame. So this whole double life came unraveling. And 29 years later, or 26 years later, just celebrated my 29th anniversary to Julianne. And so God worked in a profound way to restore my marriage. Very painful, but 26 years later, I've experienced a significant, profound, real freedom and sobriety. By the way, I learned that there's a difference between sobriety and freedom. Sobriety, whether we're a food addict or a shopping addict or an anger addict or a people pleaser, sobriety is I can stop doing this. And then freedom is I can actually move into the life that I want. Freedom is always about moving towards something and not just away from something. But the scripture that was up on the screen a minute ago is what I really want to talk about. In the Message in 1 Corinthians 6:16, if we can take a look at that again, Eugene Peterson paraphrased the verse in Corinthians that Paul wrote, that sex is more than just skin on skin, but it's as much spiritual mystery as physical fact. Sex is more than just skin on skin, but it's as much spiritual mystery as physical fact. And here's what that means to me. I had to learn that issues with pornography and compulsive masturbation or affairs, adultery, strip clubs, prostitutes, cyber sex, sexting, whatever the issue is, the issues are not about sex. And see, I thought that it was all about sex. I thought that my sexual desires were too high. I thought that if I could just ratchet down my sexual desires, that then the problem would go away. I thought that if I just tried harder and read my Bible more and prayed more, I thought that if I just got more accountability, that I'd be able to overcome this. And it really wasn't about sex. Yes, there's a physical aspect to it. But God says that sex is a spiritual mystery and that there's something bigger that we're seeking, and there's other purposes to sex other than just having an orgasm. And so I wrote a book years later as I continued on this journey of freedom. And as I started to tell my story, what I learned is that other men were going, whoa, me too, me too. And how did you get free? And how did your marriage heal? And so my book, Surfing for God, is about that. And I'm not trying to do a shameless plug for my book, but people say, why the title Surfing for God? One of my favorite quotes is from the late, great novelist and writer and British theologian, G.K. Chesterton. And he was reported to have said once that the man that's knocking on the brothel door is knocking for God. So the man that's going to a prostitute, and today that might be an online hookup, that man is going online and hooking up for God. He's actually searching for God. So I thought if that's true, the person who's going online looking at porn is surfing for God. And what do I mean by that? That we're seeking not just physical release, but we're seeking that sense of transcendence. We're seeking to literally come up and out of ourselves and to connect with someone and something bigger. We're seeking intimacy. We're seeking a sense of comfort and well-being. We're seeking a sense of security. We're seeking a sense of feeling like a man. We're feeling a sense of deep connectedness and being known, but without the risk and the vulnerability of what would be involved with God and with a real person like our wife, our fiance, our girlfriend. John Eldredge, who is a friend of Paul's and of mine and is best known for the book Wild at Heart, he said that the reason why pornography is the most addictive thing in the universe is that it lets a man feel like a real man without requiring him to be a real man. And what he's talking about there is that all of our sexual compulsion is actually meeting a legitimate need without requiring us to depend on others and to be vulnerable. He's referring to that spiritual mystery, that seeking of that place where we can just be us and be off duty and not have to perform. So there's three things that I really learned, and then I want to give you an invitation. First is that these issues are not about sex. They're about something else. The second thing is, what are these desires about? They're about legitimate, God-given desires that we don't know what to do with, and we misdirect them. The great thinker Thomas Aquinas, 13th century philosopher, theologian, and saint, he said that every sinful behavior is rooted in a legitimate God-given appetite. Every sinful behavior is rooted in a legitimate God-given appetite. So if a person is acting out sexually, if they're caught up in compulsive sin, if they're looking at porn, rather than just try to push that down, we're actually invited to say, what's the legitimate God-given desire beneath the surface? I'm actually desiring comfort because my life is really stressful right now. And looking at porn gives me comfort. What's a legitimate God-given desire? Well, I just seek intimacy so bad, but I'm not very good at it. And I'm not in a relationship right now, but relationships are too vulnerable. That's what my story has told me. So I'm going to seek out a kind of intimacy, in fact, a false intimacy without that vulnerability. Another part of this that men kind of quietly nod their heads, but that's not often talked about. And this was a part of my marriage and my pattern, unfortunately, is that pornography and sexual acting out is a way that we can feel powerful and actually make the woman in our life pay. I was talking with a man once who I brought this idea up, and I thought he'd be resistant. Like, whoa, you're saying, that I'm really that bad and that evil? And no, that's not what I was saying at all. But he goes, I think I get what you're saying. My wife and I will have a fight, or she'll turn me down for sex, and I go look at porn, and it's kind of my way of flipping the bird at her. And oftentimes we need to look into our heart. Why do we feel so powerless? Why do we feel so weak? Why do we feel so helpless with our wife or the woman in our life? Well, here's why. Because there's more at stake with our masculine heart and our masculine identity. There's more at stake with our wives or the woman in our life than with anywhere else. Most of us feel pretty competent at our jobs and at our work and things like that, but we don't feel very confident there. And so there's a lot at stake. And we can turn to these behaviors as a way of saying, oh yeah, I'll show you. So the second thing I learned was that it's actually legitimate God-given desires that get misdirected. And then finally, I learned that it's about pain inside that is mishandled. Based on my abuse, based on growing up in an alcoholic family, I was a man who was living with a tremendous amount of pain inside. And if you had asked me, are you hurting? I'd go, no. Actually, I've got Jesus and I can do all things through him. And he's my comfort and my rock. But there was this pain buried below the surface and chronic anxiety and chronic shame that I really had no idea was there because I had just learned to live with it. And I had to identify that. I had to enter into that brokenness. I had to let friends as well as counselors and some family members into that to acknowledge that I had weakness. And 26 years later, one of the foundational values and core ways that I have chosen to live as a Christian, and honestly, I'm not very good at this, is to boast in my weakness. In Corinthians 12, there's this famous chapter about Paul's sufferings and hardships. And we all know the phrase, when I am weak, he is strong. It actually says, when I'm weak, I am strong. Go ahead and check it in Corinthians 12. And there's another thing there. Paul says, I boast in my weakness. Now, I have a couple of graduate degrees. I'm actually pretty good at what I do. But at the end of the day, what I have to offer in ministry and with other men, and even in my counseling, spiritual direction work, what I have to offer is my weakness. And I like to think of that weakness for us as guys as I got no game. At any given time, relationally speaking, I've got no game. And when I acknowledge that, that's when freedom comes. A quote, and then I'll pause. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German martyr who was part of an attempt to kill Hitler and who was imprisoned, days before his death, which happened one day before the end of the war and the liberation of the concentration camps, uncanny timing. Days before his death, he wrote, "The pursuit of purity or the pursuit of chastity is not about suppressing lust, but about reorienting your life to a larger goal." And in the Christian world, we've become accustomed to bad desires, bad things, bad struggles. We push them down. We flex our spiritual muscles and we push those issues down. And with lust, that's what we've tried to do for the most part. And that's what I tried to do. And what I've learned is to actually let those legitimate God-given desires come up and to begin to reorient our lives to a whole new way of living. And that's what the word repentance means. Metanoia in Greek, and most people think it means to change our mind, and that's true. But when we change our mind, there's this sense of we're seeing life differently. And what I believe repentance is doing life differently. From trying to just not sin or manage sin to becoming a whole person and developing a capacity to love and to be free. So that's my story. And it's been painful and rocky and bumpy, but it is possible to live known and to not live hidden. It's possible to be the real me and discover who I actually am as a beloved son of God and not have to be a poser. I think we're going to take some time now and do questions.
Michael, thank you so much. It's an inspiring story, and I appreciate your candor and the way that you go after this. You know, you started talking about the poser and the double life, and you finished talking about it once again. Maybe you could spend a moment just talking to us about, you know, within that life, within the person that's faking it on the inside and the person who is real on the inside. How do we reconcile those two? And what does it take for men dealing with sexual problems or honestly any type of addiction problems for them to come out and be transparently the same on the inside and the outside?
Man, that's a great question, Paul. And that's kind of the question of the hour, right? Before I would even say, here's some steps or some tools, I think the most important thing is to recognize. And I'll talk about a couple of different R's because sometimes I'm slow and I need an acronym or a way of thinking about this, but to recognize. And to recognize that we have a problem, but the problem is different than we think. So I would recognize at moments going, oh God, I hate what I'm doing. And I promise I'm not going to do this again. Or I'm going to read Psalm 51, which I've read 10,000 times. And I used to think that Psalm 51 was feeling really bad about myself and showing God how bad I felt about this to convince him to give me grace to stop what I was doing. And all that repentance is and recognizing what the issue is going, I can't change this. I'm powerless. And so in the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous or Sex Addicts Anonymous, the very first step is we admit that we are powerless over fill in the blank, pornography, sex, alcohol, food. We admit that we're powerless and that our lives had become unmanageable as a result. And there's such a temptation as Christians to go, no, I'm not powerless. I've got Jesus and I can do all things through him who strengthens me. But how he strengthens us is through admitting our powerlessness and that the problem is deeper than we think and that it's an issue of the heart and not behavior. So that first thing is recognition. The second R is reach out. Because sexual problems and sexual struggles are really about intimacy and connection, though it's a false intimacy, we're wounded in relationship. We struggle with sexual issues in relationship, even if it's an image, and we heal in relationship. So to recognize, to reach out. And then the third R is, I've alluded to it from the Dietrich Bonhoeffer quote, but it's to reorient our lives. And that is to say, instead of how do I stop a sinful sinful behavior. What does it mean to become the kind of person who doesn't need this or who doesn't have this in their life anymore? The late great philosopher Dallas Willard talked about indirection, and that we accomplish a goal oftentimes in the spiritual life in terms of this interior change, not by directly going after something, but by indirectly going after that. And so he would say, if I try to obey the commandments, I will fail. But if I try to become the kind of person that obeys the commandments, then I have a chance of actually succeeding. I have a whole bunch of other R's, but recognize, to reach out, to reorient, that's a good start.
Thank you, Michael. When you think about reaching out, for so many men, you mentioned with your therapist, the product of loneliness. And for men who are involved in sexual activity or any form of addiction, they truly feel lonely and shame. And I'm curious what steps you give somebody to help them reach out, to be able to get from reaching out to reorienting their life. And as a person who's struggled in my own life, I'm curious to go from the double life to the transparent life. How do you get there by reaching out?
Yeah, the key word, Paul, is vulnerability. We can all say that if we're Christians, I've, quote, trusted Christ, and there's no growth in the Christian life, and there's no growth in the emotional life. And by the way, we cannot separate our spiritual health and our emotional health. Our soul is our body, our mind, our emotions, and will. And so we can't separate those two. There's no spiritual health without emotional health, and vice versa. And so vulnerability is this sense of, I will put myself in a position with another person where I can be known. And of course, the vulnerability is they roll their eyes and scrunch up their face and go, oh, you're disgusting. I can't believe that you're struggling with that. And the word vulnerability is taken from the Latin word vulnare, which actually means wound. So vulnerable is to potentially be wounded. But there's another part of vulnerability, and that is that you'll potentially be loved. See, there is no love apart from vulnerability. And that's even true with God. God is love, and he created us, and he loves us at the expense of his own broken heart. And so that vulnerability looks like this, Paul. I'm a guy who is wearing fig leaves. So in the Garden of Eden, chapter 2, they had no fig leaves, naked and unashamed. Chapter 3, they turn away from God and they trust in their own resources. And then when shame enters in and they know that there's such a thing as evil and disobedience and life apart from God, that's what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was about. They go, uh-oh, Adam, it's not good for you to see me, so I'm going to cover myself, says Eve, with fig leaves. And Eve, it's not good for you to see me, so I'm going to cover myself with fig leaves. It wasn't about body parts that God or anybody said you need to cover that up. And by the way, the fig leaves weren't God's idea. It was about their soul. It was about their inner world and their inner sense of, can I be known? And so as men, we've got to go, what are my fig leaves? For some guys, here's their fig leaf. Hey, how you doing, brother? Great. Everything's good. Better than I deserve. And in fact, well, my wife and I haven't had sex for 9 months. And I'm struggling with looking at porn, or I've got an anger issue, or my company is on the verge of bankruptcy and there's not one person who knows, but man, everything's great. That's a fig leaf. And so we need to dare to be real. And I think the conversation could go like this. Let's get together for coffee or pancakes, or during COVID quarantine, let's do a Zoom talk and let's talk about where we're weak. Let's talk about the places where we'd rather not have anybody know us. Let's talk about the places where we're powerless. And this gets to the idea of accountability. And Paul, let me know if you want me to go here, but that accountability as it's done is usually more damaging than helpful. And I talk about 3 kinds of accountability: a cop, a coach, and a cardiologist. And cop accountability is, hey, I'm struggling with sin. I'm going to share this with you. because if I sin next week when we meet for coffee, if I sin, then I'm going to have to tell you, and you as the cop will write me a ticket and say, okay, I'm with you. I'm going to pray for you. Now go try again. Problem with that is that it's external and that it's shame-based. And that's not how God works. Jesus said to the Pharisees in Matthew 15, you honor me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me and you worship me in vain. God, of course, cares about our behavior because our behavior is what causes pain or a sense of distance from God. But God is more concerned with our hearts. And so cop accountability really falls far short. Then there's the kind of coach accountability. Hey, brother, I need you to give me some tools and I need you to pray for me and give me the latest worship song. And I want you to kind of come along and be wind in my sails and help me on this journey. And man, we all need that. I need that today. But the problem is that's still external, although it's more relational. It's not as shame-based. It's more love-based, but it can't be sustained because it doesn't ultimately lead to any lasting change. So there's the cop, the coach, and then ultimately what we need in these connections and relationships to learn to live integrated where the inside and the outside match, and we're known in that way, is a person who can be a cardiologist, that they're listening to what's happening in my heart. Like that counselor who said, you're a lonely man, and are you ever at a loss for words? He wasn't even talking about my sexual sin, but he was certainly addressing it. Now, sometimes that's a counselor. Sometimes it's a pastor or a minister, but it doesn't have to be. And sometimes those well-meaning people might not actually be able to address the heart issues. I wrote my book, Surfing for God, as a way of helping men to be able to understand what those heart issues are and to try to be that cardiologist. So there's times where we need a cop. There's times where we need a coach. But Jesus is the great physician, and he's the ultimate cardiologist. But more often than not, I would actually say he works exclusively through grace and mercy coming out through other people saying, man, I've just heard your worse and I'm not going anywhere. I've just gotten to know you, and it's pretty bad in terms of the level of the struggle or the depth of the struggle or how it's impacting your marriage, but I'm not going anywhere and I'm here. And I might not have the same struggle, or maybe I might, but let's find a way together to let God's light shine into this and to allow grace to transform us so that we can be connected.
Michael, one of the things that you talked about earlier was sobriety versus freedom. And for members of our audience today who have achieved sobriety, I'm curious if you can talk to us about how you go from sobriety to freedom, especially for those people who are in 12-step and may not have heard much about that journey toward freedom and ultimately getting to a different place than just sobriety itself.
Fantastic question. First, let's define what freedom is. In our political world right now, this is a big question, right? I love liberty. I love freedom. Nobody would say they don't, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. But someone said it this way, that freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want. It's the ability to do what you most deeply want. And for a person who's a Christian, it doesn't matter if you're a crack addict or a sex addict or an alcoholic. If you are a Christian, that means that God dwells in you, that you are the temple of the Spirit, that your heart is united with Christ. You're a new creation. And therefore, in the middle of your greatest sin, at that exact moment, the deepest desire is actually to love God and to love others. That's your deepest desire, which is why every Christian feels some sense afterwards of, that's not who I want to be. And so the idea of freedom is, instead of putting all the energy on stopping a behavior, which of course is medically, relationally, maritally, and behaviorally necessary to move into the life of God, it really comes down to an awakening of the heart of what is it that I most deeply want? Who am I meant to be as I'm on the planet now as a man that's no longer preoccupied with sex or acting out? I had dreams in my heart, Paul, years before I ever got freedom and sobriety of, man, someday I want to be a psychologist, or someday I want to be a teacher. And my sin would instantly, and the evil one would whisper in my ear, good luck with that. There's no way you can do that because you're a hypocrite, or you don't know enough about God. And, thankfully, God brought that healing before I entered into that. But my whole life today is that I'm living in the freedom and the life and the marriage and the family and children that if I hadn't been exposed and found out, and if I hadn't experienced that healing, my children might not exist. I certainly wouldn't have the marriage that I want. And so freedom is really about our identity, our deepest sense of self as who God uniquely made us in his image. Who is that man in the mirror that is fearfully and wonderfully made? God says, all my works are wonderful in Psalm 139. Actually, David says that to God. And therefore, every one of us in freedom beyond sobriety can look in the mirror and say, God, you say that I'm wonderful. I have a hard time saying that because I see myself through my lens of shame. So will you teach me to be able to say that, and then help me to move into this life? Freedom for men looks like power, internal power. It's not about size or muscles or authority or position or role or credential, but an internal power that the Apostle Paul said in Philippians 3, I want to know Christ, the power of his resurrection, and to share in the fellowship of his suffering. And so there's a personal power that comes that we can direct our lives and choose the directions that we want instead of being entangled and enslaved by the compulsions and the addictions that dog our feet.
Well, thank you. That is inspiring to get to freedom from sobriety. I want to turn to the audience who has asked a question here, and it says, what responsibilities do we have as men when a friend informs us he's having an affair? Should we counsel him away from it or just stay out of the situation entirely?
That's a great question, because I encounter that all the time, both as I'm sitting with men in my ministry, but I also mentor and disciple men who are helping others. And man, I think every guy that I know has had that happen. And I have been that guy. First thing I would say is, if that man shared that with you, he's honoring you with, he thinks that you're a safe person. Secondly, he may be saying that and sharing it to somehow minimize his own guilt, almost like a safety valve to let some of that pressure off. But I also imagine that he is sharing that because he doesn't want to be doing this. Unless a man is a hard-hearted narcissist or sociopath, if he's a married man and having an affair, of course, there's a part of him that doesn't want to be doing this because it doesn't align with who he really is. And so I think the best thing that can happen is to tell that person, I'm not going anywhere. I don't judge you. And I've got my junk too. But brother, I'm going to kindly, lovingly be in your face. Here's what that kind of adultery and sin is about. We all know that in the 10 Commandments, it says, do not commit adultery. And sometimes we lose perspective about what those commands actually mean and what they're about. Here's what that commandment means. This is Michael's paraphrase. Do not commit adultery is equal to God saying, do not brush your teeth with an electric toaster. Now somebody's going, you lost me there. Well, if I brush my teeth with an electric toaster, first of all, it could kill me. It could rip my gums out. I could be electrocuted. But most of all, it's not going to clean my teeth, right? So brushing your teeth is meant to keep your teeth clean and healthy. Do not commit adultery it does great damage to our marriage, to our heart. It perpetuates living with fig leaves. It perpetuates hiddenness. It perpetuates the sense that I can't get my real needs met in a real relationship, this real marriage. I've got to be hidden, or I've got to pretend. And I can get it met by what? By reaching to this tree where there's some really good fruit and taking it and eating it. And so as those issues are explored and as a safe person can be with them, I think it's appropriate depending on that relationship, to say, brother, I'm going to be in your face. This isn't okay. And here's the deal: if you lose the relationship because of that, it wasn't a great relationship to start with. Because if I have somebody in my life who will come and speak to me about my junk, I'm going to take that seriously if that person matters to me. And therefore, you might be the only person for that friend that can be both truth of here's what this is doing and grace alongside. And so truth and grace always plays out in relationship, not with Bible verses, not with trying to prove why it's wrong. It's always the relationship that provides that freedom.
Well, you mentioned the 10 Commandments, and we got time for one more question here. And it says, the 10 Commandments tell us not to covet our neighbor's wife, but there's a difference between thinking a woman is attractive and fixating on her to the detriment of one's own relationship. How can men keep the former from becoming the latter?
I think that it comes down to paying attention to our desires. If when those desires come up, you go, oh, that's bad, that's wrong, I shouldn't think about that, and you just kind of move on. I mean, to move on or not think about it once or twice, that could be a good way of dealing with it. Maybe it's just a random thought that pops in. But if it starts to be preoccupying, if it starts to be something you return to again and again, we need to be curious and attentive. I wonder what's going on. Is it because in the last conversation I had with that neighbor, her eyes lit up and she just said, wow, you're such a good dad. And we haven't heard that from our spouse for a while. Well, suddenly it may not be wanting to have sex, but it's just the presence of that beauty and that aliveness that's awakening our heart. And so coveting is almost always about something in the heart being awoken. And Psalm 42 is a great example of the psalmist being in a place of pain or deprivation or dissatisfaction, and then he's attentive. Most of us probably know there's a church song, as the deer panteth for the water, so my soul panteth after thee. And that's not a warm, fuzzy camp song. Here's what it means. As the dehydrated, dying animal is in the desert, God, that's how I feel right now. And then he goes on in the next several verses to say, there's a church split. I used to go to the temple with the multitudes, and now I don't. And then he stops in his tracks, not once, but twice in that psalm with all this pain. And he goes, why are you so downcast, O my soul? Why are you so disturbed within me? And then he says it again. Why are you so downcast, O my soul? Why so disturbed within me? So here's what that might look like, coveting our neighbor's wife. I have had these feelings, God, toward this woman, and it feels captivating or compelling, and I don't want to go there. I don't want to cross that line, whether in my mind and heart or whether actually. So why are you so hungry, oh my heart, oh my soul? Why are you so captivated with this? And ask God to give you insight into that. There's a verse in Proverbs chapter 27, verse 7, and I never saw this till 5 years ago, and I've been a Christian 40 years. I never saw it in relation to sexual struggles, lust, etc. The writer of Proverbs says, the one who is full loathes honey, but to the one who is hungry, even what is bitter tastes sweet. So if my heart is hungry and I've not been feeding upon a healthy, engaged, connected relationship where I can be known, my heart's going to be hungry. And so I look to my neighbor and I start to covet her and her beauty or whatever it is. And that's bitter if I'm a married man, because it's going to lead to pain and betrayal, and I'm going to have to live deceived. That's bitter, but I'm hungry. So it sure tastes sweet. The best thing that we can do to not cross that line from that 10th commandment is to feed our hearts. One of the best ways to deal with an addiction, you starve an addiction as you feed your soul. And the soul is our body, our mind, our emotions, and will. So there's an embodied aspect to that. But that's a great question, because that commandment really spells out how do we live with these dueling tensions inside of us. And I'll just close the question with this thought. In Psalm 86, King David, the man who not only did he commit adultery with Bathsheba, there's a lot of theological, biblical research that's saying that David actually raped and assaulted Bathsheba because of the power differential, and because the bathing that the story talks about, she was actually involved in a ceremonial ritual of cleansing. So she was worshiping God, and in that context, he has her. And in Psalm 86, part of his healing journey, he says, God, teach me your ways and give me an undivided heart. And so we're all divided men. Everybody but Jesus was and is a divided man. And the work is bringing those two parts together. The part of us that loves our wife, the part of us that can covet our neighbor's wife, the part of us that can lust, the part of us that can say, man, I wish I was divorced right now because my marriage is so painful. We love God and we have idols. And as we hold those tensions in together and say, God, give me an undivided heart, that's where God meets us, not when we're all together. The very struggles that we think keep us from God and the freedom that we long for, those struggles are not a barrier, they're a bridge. They're a bridge to the life that we were created to live.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for today. Your words are inspiring. Your story is powerful. And we're just thankful for you coming on and giving us a taste of all the things that you're doing and a little bit of your story. For all the people who've been on our webinar today, I want to thank you for attending. For those of you who have had a chance to listen today and would like to share this message with others, it's been taped today on Crowdcast. It'll be posted on our website, and we thank you for listening and sharing this with family and friends. Coming up on November the 17th, we'll have our next webcast. Greg Jones, the Dean of the Duke Divinity School, will be coming on and talking about what it means to have holy friends. So I thank you so much. Please feel free to follow us on social media. We're always out there and trying to spread this message, and we thank you so much for your time and attention today. Have a wonderful and blessed day.